What time is it? The left foot's lame, the right leg's in pain. Is this?
Mr. Stevens, what are you doing up?
I'm simply trying to put things in order.
I'm the housekeeper. That's my job. Here, sit down.
No, you would help me. You've done quite enough.
Yes, Mr. Stevens, I know, and I told you I'd be back to help with that later.
No, you've helped me enough. You know I'm not talking about housekeeping.
Well, let's continue organizing your papers later. For now, it's time you took your medicine and had a rest.
That vile concoction.
It keeps you healthy. Why, you look much better already.
It is not my appearance that concerns me. It's my disappearance.
What are you talking about? You're not going anywhere.
Oh, come now, Mrs. Smith. Let's be honest with each other. I know I'm near the end. I've told my doctors it's a pretty square fight between life and death.
Now, Mr. Stevens,
I'm under no illusions. I know I'm at the end, and I'm quite resigned to it. What is it?
You don't seem resigned. On the contrary, you look very agitated and troubled.
You know, you were right. I've spent so much of my life answering critics, shouting down ignorance. It seems incredible to me that I will no longer be able to fight back.
Your life's work. Your accomplishments will speak for you.
As will my failures. 76 years. Ouch. 76 years. What will they say about me when I'm gone, I wonder? How do you think I'll be remembered?
Well, you've had a wonderful and important career. You were successful in law and in politics, and you made many people happy.
I also made many people angry. I could never suffer fools gladly. Even as a child, what is it?
Excuse me, Mr. Stevens, but I simply can't imagine you as a child. I'm sorry, please continue.
Even as a child, I was uncommonly serious and keenly aware of life's injustices. Just look at me. People always ask me, do you never smile? I learned firsthand the impact oppression has on those less fortunate. As a child, I had little to smile about. I learned the hatred and the bigotry of the world very early on. It forged my life and tempered my soul. But wasn't I the lucky one? I had only one clubfoot. My older brother Joshua had two. People told me my clubfoot was proof I was a devil's child. Later in life, at the peak of my career, as a member of Congress, they called me Old Clubfoot.
They also called you Old Commoner, and you should be proud of it. Besides, I'm sure it will be remembered how well you overcame your physical disadvantages. I still smile when I think of the time that woman asked you for a lock of your hair.
Yes, poor dear. Not a hair on my entire body for decades, and she asks for a lock of my hair. I'll never forget the expression on her face when I took off my wig, I handed it to her and said, "Here, take all of it."
I wish I could have been there.
Lydia.
Mr. Stevens, it seems strange to hear you call me by my first name.
Oh, yes, I know. Mrs. Smith, you have been my housekeeper for 20 years. And after all that time, I think we may call each other by our first names. To hell with what they say.
Mr. Stevens.
I always called you Lydia out of respect. And I want others also to respect you.
Yes, I suppose so, Mr. Stevens.
No, not Mr. Stevens. Come now, say it.
Thaddeus. It's not easy to unlearn the old ways, proper ways.
Necessary ways.
Yes, unfortunately necessary for them.
Lydia, you are an exceptional woman. I have been lucky with the two women in my life, my mother and you.
I wish I had known her.
She was an extraordinary woman. When my drunkard of a father, if you can call him a father, deserted us, she struggled to raise her 4 children, a woman of great energy, strong will, great piety. She worked night and day just to educate her devil child.
It may not have been a very auspicious beginning. Look at all the success you had later.
And it isn't as if there weren't other failures. As a matter of fact, one of my greatest victories was also one of my greatest failures.
What do you mean?
As a young lawyer, I was so intent on winning cases. I took a case for John Delaplane, a slave owner who wanted to repossess Charity Butler and her 2 children. Charity had run away from Delaplane years before and had married Henry Butler and had 2 children by him, Harriet and Sophia. But eventually, Delaplane found her and kidnapped her and her 2 children. Her distraught husband hired an attorney who argued that Charity's former master had brought her into Pennsylvania enough times that she'd been there a total of 6 months, making her a free person under Pennsylvania law. Charity had meticulously tallied her days of frequent visits. I argued this thing all the way to the state Supreme Court, proving under law that unless a single visit had lasted 6 months, Charity could not claim freedom. Well, I won. But I lost. That case turned to ashes in my mouth. Never again in my life would I prosecute such a case. I deeply regret taking that case against Charity Butler. But it did open my eyes to the evils of slavery.
Do you regret many things in your life?
No, not at all. I've always felt I was on the right side of a battle, except for that one case. Of course, in the process, I have made many important enemies.
Well, it's not surprising you made enemies. It certainly seems your position was politically dangerous.
I suppose so. It is a wonder I survived politically at all. Even my mother tried to warn me. Lydia, she was right. Of course it created enemies. Once a young pregnant Negro woman was found dead, possibly murdered, near the well at the southwest corner of North Washington and Railroad Streets, outside the old Presbyterian Church in Gettysburg, just around the corner from my house on Chambersburg Street. Can you believe it? They tried to accuse me in the Gettysburg newspapers of committing that horrid deed. Usually, I do not respond to such accusations. Although I did finally sue one Gettysburg newspaper owner over it, Jacob Lefevre of the Compiler. He was convicted of criminal libel and defamation and sentenced to fees, court fees and fines, $12,000, a sizable fortune in those days, and to 3 months in prison. But Lefevre's friend, the governor, pardoned him. No worry, Lefevre didn't have to pay his fines either, because I bought his estate and gave it to his estranged wife. This created another little stir in the press and left a few people wondering. But I suppose the people of Gettysburg and Adams County believed in me because they sent me to the state legislature and sent me back 6 times in the next 10 years. What?
I'm reminded of another story, of an old arch nemesis of yours, Alexander Harris.
Oh? Which story?
You remember, the time you and Harris encountered each other on the sidewalk, and Harris bellowed, "I never step aside for a skunk," and you, holding your nose as you strolled past him, replied, "I always do." Thaddeus,
What is it?
there's something I've always wanted to ask you.
Well, what is it?
Please promise not to take offense.
Oh, Mrs. Smith. I'm much more likely to give offense than to take it. What is it?
That railroad you tried to sponsor.
Oh, no! The infamous railroad, the tapeworm. I suppose that was controversial.
Controversial. Why, you wanted to connect the Wrightsville line with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Controversial indeed. Everyone knew the Wrightsville line was set to run right along past your Mariah Iron Works twice.
Yes, well, that's really a big misconception, I mean, the people forget that Mariah Iron Mill was permanently closed long before the scheduled completion of the new rail line, the so-called tapeworm, which had to wait another 50 years to be completed because I had lost legislative power in the Pennsylvania state legislature.
And yet I recall, even as you were losing money at your other ironworks in Caledonia, you still refused to lay off any of your workers.
Yes. Well, why should they have to pay for my poor business decision? I could afford the loss, they could not. Actually, it came almost as a relief when I learned that Confederate troops under General Jubal Early deliberately destroyed my ironworks at Caledonia. When I was told the rebels had burned down my forges, I asked, oh, did they burn my debts too?
Well, I suppose you won't be remembered as a great iron master. Mr. Stevens, you asked me earlier how I thought you might be remembered. And now I ask you, how do you want to be remembered?
Well, of all the things I fought for, that I cared most deeply about, foremost, without doubt, is my devotion to education.
I remember in your first year on the state legislature, you defied your own political party and your constituents by supporting an $18,000 appropriation for a new college in Gettysburg.
I argued for the establishment of the college, and I fought for the monies to build its first buildings and provided the 12.5 acres those buildings were built on, and I helped found and govern the college's branch medical school in Philadelphia from 1839 to 1861. Let demagogues note it for future use, and let it be carried on the wings of the wind to the ears of every one of my constituents that in matters of this kind, I would rather hear the quietly approving voice of one judicious, intelligent, and enlightened mind than to be greeted by the loud hurrahs of the whole host of ignorance. That's what I told him. We got our college. Stevens Hall and Stevens Street are two of the campus properties named after me, but my honor has lost a little luster in the case of the stream that you and I will remember as Stevens Run, with all the new development in that gracious town. The stream has, well, the run has seen little more than a trickle lately. I hear that students at the college are now calling it the mighty Tiber. But when they write my obituary, I hope they'll remember that in 1835, 3 years after the founding of the college, I led the campaign to save free public education in Pennsylvania. I trust when we are called upon to consider this question, we will all take lofty ground, see beyond the narrow space which now circumscribes our vision, and so cast our votes that the blessing of free public education shall be conferred on every son and daughter of Pennsylvania, shall be carried home to the poorest child, of the poorest inhabitants, of the meanest hut of your mountains, that they may be well prepared to act well their parts in this land of freedom, and lay on earth a broad foundation for that enduring knowledge that goes on enduring and increasing through increasing eternity.
Thank you, Thaddeus.
For what?
For all you have done for my people.
For your people. Consider what they have done for the good of the nation, and to emancipate themselves. What I have done is little by comparison. Lydia, I can never say I knew what it was to be in your shoes, but I do know what it is to be poor and downtrodden.
You always were such a fierce abolitionist.
And such a fierce college trustee. 1854. Remember, Pennsylvania College, later renamed Gettysburg College, was experiencing critically dwindling enrollment. The coalition of the college's professors and trustees quickly gathered power to pass a resolution to move the 22-year-old school from Gettysburg to York, Pennsylvania. When I learned of the scheme, I rushed back to Gettysburg, determined to oppose, single-handed if necessary, a very determined, mutinous crew of academic deserters.
I'm glad you fought to keep that little college in my old hometown, Gettysburg. I believe it was an act inspired by providence and destiny, as later evidenced by the acts of the Great Rebellion. I do give thanks for you every day, Thaddeus, not only for your defense of my people, but for your defending of my personal honor and my reputation. I know we both have kept quiet about many things, and I know it couldn't have been easy defending me in a society that disapproved of us living together. Why, if they only knew how we...
Lydia, we both promised each other never to speak of such things. I was never ashamed of you. And you were always much more than a housekeeper. These past 20 years, you have proven to be the person closest to me, my most trusted, faithful confidant. For this, I thank you. Now, let us spare the subject. I think we perhaps best speak of other things.
Or perhaps it would be better if we spoke no more at all tonight. You should be asleep, you know. You have company in the morning.
Yes. I'm sorry.
Should I send word he's not to come?
No. I'll see him.
I believe people would be surprised to know you sometimes visit with President Buchanan.
Old Buck. We were never really enemies, you know. Actually, as young men, we got along pretty well. During my Gettysburg years, Buck actually invited me to join his party, the Democrats. But of course, after the principle, I couldn't do that. But once another time, out of respect, Buck actually refused to take a case against me.
Oh, really? Then why did you call Mr. Buchanan what was it? A blob of...
A bloated mass of political putridity? Yes. But he made me so damn angry.
You also said he died of lockjaw.
Well, yes, Buck refused to debate or even speak at important times during the national presidential election.
2 lifelong confirmed Pennsylvania bachelors.
Meaning?
Well, he is your opposite in every way. He's a Democrat, you're a Republican. He lives uptown, you live downtown.
Yes, well, my main problem with Buck had to do with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We were always poles apart on the slavery issue. But Lydia, you know as well as I that in politics it isn't good to harbor a grudge. We can disagree and still be civil.
Well, I still say you two could not be more opposite.
Well, yes, but opposites can work together for the right cause. You know how many people thought that Lincoln and I were extreme opposites. But I saw us as a kind of partnership, each needling and needing the other to keep in line. I did not always approve of the president's speed, or I should say lack of speed in handling things, but I supported his values. I felt the Emancipation Proclamation was long overdue. And as for malice toward none and charity for all, I think that a noble proposition, but I do not believe the rebellious southern states should be allowed to get off without some retribution, some punishment. I mean, how can we have no malice against a group that systematically persecuted the Negro people and seceded from the Union?
What is it?
Oh, it's just a conversation Lincoln and I once had about Secretary of War Simon Cameron. I told Lincoln I thought Cameron was profiteering from some high prices on war contracts. Lincoln asked, "You don't think Cameron would steal, do you?" I replied, "He wouldn't steal a red-hot stove."
What did Lincoln say?
He laughed. But apparently when he told Cameron the joke, Cameron got very upset. Told Lincoln that he wanted me to retract. Cameron asked me to retract that statement.
Did you?
Well, I went to Lincoln and I told him, well, look, I said Cameron wouldn't steal a red-hot stove. All right, I retract the statement. Cameron would steal a red-hot stove. Lincoln told me I outdid him on that one.
I declare, politicians, the wheeling and dealing that goes on.
Thank you all for coming, the lovely audience. Hope you enjoyed it. All too short, right? Over before it starts. We are here for a few minutes if you wish to remain and ask questions. Ross Hetrick here will introduce, is the President, Ross, come on up here, of the Thaddeus Stevens Society, now international, based in Gettysburg. By the way, tonight you saw our dear actress, lovely Rebecca, performing this role first time for an audience. Not an inexperienced theater person, but just closed a very successful run of Civil War voices here in town. Perhaps some of you saw it. I know Ross did, and Mike. Mike, stand up and take a bow. He's our stage manager. Civil War Voices, which just closed a couple weeks ago up here at the Community Theater on York Street. So we'll just stay here if you have questions. If you wish to escape into the night.
That gentleman right there has a question.
Yeah.
What was the age difference between Stevens and Smith?
I'm going to defer on some of these. Here's the Stevens expert.
I don't think there was a huge amount of age difference. He was 76 at the when he died in 1868, and I think she continued to live until the 1880s. It might have been like 20-year difference.
She outlived him by many years.
And interestingly enough, this is an interesting fact about Lydia Hamilton Smith. She was born on Valentine's Day and died on Valentine's Day.
Oh, how about that?
Right. A lover to the end.
So another Thaddeus Stevens question, but you mentioned in the dialogue there that Thaddeus provided the land for Pennsylvania College and the funds for a building. But I've also heard that Thaddeus was instrumental in raising funds to build Christ Lutheran Church across the street from
His house.
Right. I don't know about raising funds for the church, but he was a member of the church and had a pew, just as he had a pew at the Presbyterian Church. He rarely filled those pews.
But he paid his pew tax.
But he paid his pews.
He was covering a few bases.
And he was, as far as an expansion, I'm not familiar with that. You know, if you can provide information on it, that would be helpful. Just to let you know to be completely clear about his relation with Gettysburg College, he got $18,000 from the state legislature to build the first building. Okay,
Penn Hall.
Penn
Imagine
Hall.
building that for $18,000 a day.
Yeah, and then he was put onto the board, and the next thing they needed was land to build the building on. So they went around to a number of different property owners in the area who refused to sell to them. The college was not very popular at that time. So anyway, Thaddeus Stevens, who was a large landowner, said, well, I have a lot of land here in the middle of the city, or at least it became the middle of the city. And he didn't actually give it to them. What he did was he let each member of the board come up with what they think was a fair price per acre, and then he took the average of that and sold it to them for that.
It was about $600, wasn't it?
I don't know the figure, but
In the money of the day. The figures that are used in the script are the actual dollars of that day. In other words, we did not update it to inflationary.
so are there questions?
No more questions? Oh, surely you have some. Like, what was it? How many here have seen the 2012 Spielberg biopic called Lincoln
Yeah, that's
with Tommy Lee Jones?
Okay, you probably wonder, did he sleep with Lydia Hamilton Smith?
Your question always comes
Well,
up.
I'm surprised it didn't come up, but I'll
Very
bring it up.
restrained
Okay,
group.
I'll bring it up. There's a couple of different things about that. First off, Tony Kushner, who wrote the screenplay, admitted in a panel that I saw that Lydia Hamilton Smith wasn't even in Washington at the time of the approval of the 13th Amendment. So that scene of him coming home and jumping into bed with 13th Amendment and Lydia Hamilton Smith could never have happened. Okay, that's the one thing. The relationship between Lydia Hamilton Smith and Thaddeus Stevens. Lydia Hamilton Smith was a very devout Catholic, and is buried in consecrated ground. And under the old rules, they didn't put adulterers in consecrated ground. And she was very proud of her service for Thaddeus Stevens. In fact, she has it on her tombstone in the Catholic cemetery over in Lancaster. Also, she had her adult sons living in the house when she was housekeeper for Thaddeus Stevens. So that sort of would cut down on any sort of illicit activity.
From a son from her, she had two sons from an earlier,
Yeah,
from marriage before.
well, she was a widow. Smith was, the name of her husband. And also, Thaddeus Stevens actually denied it, that he had any sort of relations with anybody, while he was, living in Lancaster. The wording of it was such that it's sort of a non-denial denial, but he did put out a denial that he didn't have, and as he put it, he never had any children with anybody, which I don't know. Now, on the other side of it, as to why people would say, another reason that people accused him of it was because he did request that they refer to her as Mrs. Smith rather than Lydia, and it was a custom of the day to refer to servants by their first names. And so that was sort of seen as, he's treating her with too many airs. But that was more or less his egalitarian equality aspect. Now, on the other hand, he did a lot of business deals with her. He would sell her properties, and then she would he would sell her properties, and she also took care of a lot of his business affairs in his household. He also had an oil painting done of her, which is kind of a stretch for a servant that you buy a oil painting for. But as I portray Thaddeus Stevens, I end up saying, but I want to say categorically, I did not have sex with that woman.
So this is the, which portrait was that he commissioned? Portrait of Lydia. Is
What
it
do you
the,
mean, what portrait? It's the
Well, it's-
Lydia Hamilton Smith portrait.
yeah, okay, okay. So it's one that we have online with color?
No, well, we have it in color online, but it's actually owned by an department store heiress who lives out some other place, and we're trying to get it back to Lancaster at this point.
Not Mrs. Sam Walton?
No,
Okay. All right.
Mrs. Bucko, I think.
What caused his death?
What caused his death? Well, back in those days, you just sort of lingered. They didn't have a diagnosis abilities back then. The closest it's come is that he died of liver cancer eventually.
He also, I was reading the other day, I don't know how authoritative, that he had at the end some gastrointestinal and other problems down here, but I just played it with a cough, so.
Oh, also, he died in his bed. This is as far as the conversation, that really didn't happen, on his last night. He was laying in bed with nuns around him, and Lydia Hamilton Smith was there and some other people and stuff like that. It was interesting, by the way, we might have to work on a little correction or reword.
Oh, no, not another one.
Because you talk about your visit with Buchanan the
Yeah.
next day. Well, Buchanan was dead by then.
Oh, yeah, but this is poetic and dramatic
Right,
license.
okay.
But I mean, the nature of the relationship as described in the play is pretty accurate,
Right.
isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
After he passed, what happened to his estate?
Well, it's
As
interesting
well.
you know, we'll get to Ross in a minute, but how many of you know, this is quiz, I'm a college professor, but don't worry, and so is Virgil. Do we have any other teachers in the room? All right, very good, back there. We'll get you, how many of you know that Thaddeus Stevens is one of only 33 people to lie in state in the main rotunda of the Capitol in Washington, D.C.? I'm not gonna ask you to name them, but of those 33, as far as I know, only one is a woman. Think about who that might be. And Thaddeus Stevens was what, the third or fourth?
The third, after Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
Just to let you know, that was the new Capitol. There had been a Capitol before that. I don't know who laid in state in that Capitol, if anybody, but that Capitol was just shortly completed before the Civil War.
It's the present Capitol was still
Right,
under
I think it was
construction.
still under construction during the
We'll get to
Civil
this
War.
man's question. Also, I just have to follow up. With all of that, we have, as far as we know, have never had a U.S. postage stamp dedicated to Thaddeus.
No,
When
we
you
haven't.
think of all the people and things that we have stamps for, it's mind-boggling. But anyway, this man asked about.
Right, about his estate. His estate, he had a very complicated will, and it took up until about 1900 to figure it all out and to work it out. And there were people who were claiming, there was this one woman who claimed to be the wife of his nephew and was supposed to get some payment, but she was denied. But the most interesting part about his estate was that he left $50,000 to his nephew, who was confusingly named Thaddeus Stevens Jr., even though it was not his son. Okay? But he was sort of a ne'er-do-well nephew, and Thaddeus Stevens put into the will that he'd get the $50,000 if he gave up the sauce, okay? Which he didn't. Okay? And instead, the money went to the founding of the Thaddeus Stevens College of Technology, which was initially a technical school, still a technical school, but they changed the name to make it sound more impressive. But and that's one of the best two-year schools in the country as far as teaching technology. And he was very specific in his will that this school would be open to all religions and races, and they all had to be served at the same table.
It's in Lancaster, PA, by the way. How many of you know about Stevens Tech, as we call it? Very good school.
Which is also the only place that you have a Thaddeus Stevens statue. There's one plan down in Washington at the former Stevens School down in Washington. And we're also raising funds to try to get a Stevens statue here in Gettysburg. We had sort of a very disappointing occurrence that a number of years ago they put up a statue in front of Stevens Hall on Gettysburg College. The statue wasn't of Stevens, it was of Lincoln, which around here, the Gettysburg College, which we have worked with in the past, but if you look at their literature, you would think they were founded by Lincoln rather than by Stevens. Yes?
What, if anything, did Mrs. Smith get in the will?
Actually, she got $5,000, which is a sum. She was able to basically go in and take any items that belonged to her that, without any question, he actually put that in there. She used that money, along, she also owned some houses. She owned a house before his death, and with that money, she actually became a very successful boarding house owner down in Washington.
Speaking of Washington, how many of you know who the one woman is who has laid in state in the National Rotunda in Washington?
Can I guess?
Sure.
Eleanor Roosevelt?
No.
You'd think so, and there are other candidates.
I can tell you who it is.
Wait, let's just see if anybody else knows. Think of back of the bus,
Rose Parks.
who also has a postage stamp.
No, we're all
If you're
for
interested,
interested.
Rosa, don't get me wrong, but if you want a statue and if you want a postage stamp for Thaddeus, there is a citizens committee. You don't write to your congressman, although it probably wouldn't hurt. But a couple of years ago, some of us in the society went up to Danville, it's almost on the Canadian border in northern Vermont, to the dedication of a Thaddeus Stevens post office. You probably know it takes literally an act of Congress to get a post office building named after a person. And is it right, Ross, that Thaddeus Stevens has two post offices?
Well, he has a town named after him in Pennsylvania, which is, the post office there is known as the Stevens Post Office because it's in Stevens, Pennsylvania.
Did he help the town get the post office?
What happened was, there's Stevens, Pennsylvania, okay, and the town was named after Thaddeus Stevens, not because he was the father of the 14th Amendment or because he was the father of public education in Pennsylvania, but it was because he got a post office for that town. Constituent service is very interesting. And also, the post office in Danville was named after Thaddeus Stevens because Bernie Sanders put through a bill through Congress.
Along with, I should say, with some Southern Republicans and Democrats in that coalition, but I didn't think I'd live to see the day when we had Southern senators want a Thaddeus Stevens post office, because, you know, there has been this, we won't get into the whole Reconstruction thing unless you want to. But your question about the estate was interesting. Not long ago, I happened to be looking out here at Fayetteville at some photostats of the plat books of the Registry of the Land in Muschamp State Park and Caledonia and all that. And Ross, we haven't discussed this, but some of them said Stevens Tract. And I'm wondering, are those still, I guess, well, they've been assumed by state forest lands?
Well, actually, you know, it's interesting to bring that up because somebody, I was staffing the Thaddeus Stevens blacksmith shop out of Caledonia, and somebody said that they were doing research and they found that land was still registered in Thaddeus Stevens' name. So I actually went to land records in Franklin County over in Chambersburg, and that's not true.
Okay.
So nothing is, he still doesn't own land in Pennsylvania. By the way, before I forget it, if you're interested in helping us try to get a post stamp for Thaddeus Stevens, we have postcards out on the table outside that you're welcome to take and send in to the Citizens Committee on postage stamps. Also, we have a list. If you want to be on our email list, you can give us the name and email, and we will send out emails. I won't drown you in emails. I send out less than one a month, and you know, which includes like our bi-yearly or semi-annual newsletter. So if you want to, you know, sort of keep up on Thaddeus Stevens events. Now, you had a question?
Just a sort of a side question, but what kind of a relationship do we think Thaddeus Stevens had with Samuel Simon Schmucker?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Are you a Gettysburg College alum or?
No, I just happen to live here.
Oh, okay. it was rather tense, I would say. Thaddeus Stevens, because he didn't go to church, and also was, he actually was accused of being an atheist, and he replied that only a fool would not believe in God, and I believe in hell, particularly for the person who libeled me with that suggestion. Anyway, so he was, you know, somewhat distant from religion, whereas Samuel Schmucker was kind of, how would I put it?
Bible beater.
Bible beater, you know, extreme person.
And a very boring sermonizer.
Yeah, right. And
Sorry, Simon.
But he worked with Thaddeus Stevens because, you know, he had the influence in the legislature and so on and so forth. And they really came to cross purposes in 1854 when Samuel Schmucker wanted to move the college. And Thaddeus Stevens basically said, "We paid for the college, you're going to keep it here." Okay. That basically was his position. You know, we're not going to get out of this after we went to the legislature and got 18,000. And that was a very controversial issue back then about the college. And not only did Thaddeus Stevens not have the support, he didn't have the support of the population in Adams County. He didn't have the support of his political party. So he was just sort of out there on his own. So those two things, plus when they dedicated this Stevens Hall at Gettysburg College, Samuel Schmucker made a special point that this was only because of Thaddeus Stevens' dedication to education and had nothing to do with his efforts to impeach Andrew Johnson, which was going on at the time. So it was not a real close relationship, but you know, they didn't fire off Twitter video messages about each other.
Quick follow-up to that is if you've seen the new statue in front of Thaddeus Stevens Hall, that is, as Ross mentioned, the statue of the seated Lincoln, if you look, you don't have to look closely, you can be across the street. If you look at it, it's one of the most bizarre statues of Lincoln I've ever seen. He's there, he's writing with a quill pen. I don't think he ever used a quill. He used all kinds of other writing instruments, probably never a quill. So it's a good statue. However, it looks like, and I'll show you, as I said, what it looks like, as if Lincoln had just been sermonized by Samuel Simon Schmucker. Because Lincoln is like this. If you watch in the chair, he's like this.
Yeah, it sort of looks like he's sleeping.
It's like he fell asleep during the sermon.
Yeah, and they have him sign the Emancipation Proclamation on a book. Like, I mean, really, I mean, couldn't he like have it on a desk? if he was signing it or something like that. So I don't.
We're not making fun.
I don't agree with you. I don't think it's a good statue.
No, compositionally, it's not good. I think as an artist, it's well, the guy, it's the same guy, I think, who made the statue in front of the Gettysburg Baltimore Street Post Office. As a work of art, that's what I mean. It's not badly executed, it's just, it's ill-conceived that it's a quill and it looks like he's falling asleep, and then we're sensitive that, you know, if you have Stevens Hall, one of the few buildings dedicated to Stevens during his lifetime, why do we put a statue of Lincoln in front of it?
Yeah, like there's like 7 statues of Lincoln in Gettysburg. You know, can't we have one statue of Thaddeus Stevens? Yeah. Okay.
So, you mentioned Johnson. Was he involved in, heavily involved in the impeachment of Johnson?
Oh, yeah, he was the guy who was against
Okay.
Andrew Johnson, yeah. He definitely, that reminds me of a joke that he just was continuously going after Johnson. He was like the first person who wanted to impeach Johnson, because the basic problem was that Johnson was a Southern Democrat, you know, and he was trying to undermine everything that the North had won during the Civil War. And the Congress, under the leadership of Thaddeus Stevens, was trying to reform the South through Reconstruction. And Johnson was basically trying to sabotage that all the time. Think of like Obamacare and Trump, you know, that is, you know, this modern day. This has always been the problem with our system, where the legislature proposes, and then you have, if you have somebody in the opposite party, they will try to sabotage it, which, in any case. So one time, these people who were friends of both Stevens and Johnson came to Stevens and said, "You really ought to not be so hard on Johnson. He was a self-made man just like you." And he says, "Well, you know, I never really thought of it that way, but that would take a great responsibility from the Almighty."
There's a film about that. I don't know how accurate it is. It came out during World War II.
Tennessee
Following up
Johnson.
on this question.
Tennessee Johnson.
It's called Tennessee Johnson. Philadelphia's own Lionel Barrymore portrays Thaddeus in that film, and Van Heflin plays President Johnson. Andrew Johnson, that is. It's an interesting film, but I don't know how accurate it is historically.
No, it's not accurate at all. But let me tell you something, just talking about movies, there's now 3 movies that have Thaddeus Stevens in them. Okay, we talked about 2 of them already, which is the Lincoln movie and the and Tennessee Johnson.
Who knows the third?
Yeah, who knows the third? Okay, it's an incredibly famous film that is actually, when I took film courses, was sort of the birth of the film industry, which was Birth of a Nation. You know, I don't know if anybody, has anybody seen Birth of a Nation here? Okay, it was made in 1915. It was the greatest technological film of its time, and it is probably still the most racist film ever made. and
In the U.S. anyway.
And in the movie, Thaddeus Stevens is the villain. They don't even use his name, they use Austin Stoneman as the name, but it's obviously Thaddeus Stevens. He is the villain, and the Ku Klux Klan are the heroes. And that was a huge moneymaker of a film made by D.W. Griffith. And if you see it, it just employs all of the techniques that were later adopted by other movies like montage and fast-paced cutting and close-ups and all these other different devices. But it was really racist. And the thing about it is, it was so racist, it portrayed blacks in all the bad ways, but it had no blacks in the movie. Everybody who was in the movie as a black used black coloring on their face. So it was so racist they wouldn't even employ blacks. So, well, I appreciate everybody coming here, and we have, as I said, a list if you want to get emails from the Thaddeus Stevens Society, and also the cards for the postage stamp, and also we have some book selection. If you want to read a little bit more about Thaddeus Stevens, we have a little free biography, a free 4-page biography left that you can pick up. So, thank you very much.
things.
Very nice job, guys.
Thanks for coming.
Yes.